Okay, so this video is going to go over a problem that's similar to the fourth problem on the first problem set, and this is how to deal with a price floor or a price ceiling. The question that we're going to do is a little bit more detailed. It also goes over a subsidy, but I think that would be good background review for people as well. So if you can walk through this with me, then I think you'll be well prepared to do problem set 1, question 4. All right, so the question in this example or this problem really focuses on a labor market, right? And so in a labor market, remember that the labor is going to be provided by workers. That's the supply curve, and the demand is going to come from the employers. That's going to give us the demand curve. And instead of having price in here, we're going to have wages. And please pardon Leo as he walks across the pages. He's so excited about these videos. Okay, so the first question is really to figure out what is the equilibrium wage and quantity of labor in the market if there is no interaction from the government. Okay, so we're going to start by just taking a very simple supply and demand curve and setting them equal to each other to give us the equilibrium. So in this market, the supply of wages, the quantity supplied, is equal to 10 times the wage rate. And the quantity demanded is equal to 80 minus 10 times the wage rate. And so we just set those two things equal to each other. Leo, that's very exciting, I know. And we're going to solve for the wage rate that makes these two things equal, and then the quantity of labor that's going to be supplied. So we're going to get all of the wages together on the left-hand side. So adding 10W to each side gives us 20W on the left-hand side and nothing on the right-hand side. So we get 20W is equal to 80, or the wage is equal to 80 over 20, or the wage is equal to $4. And the quantity, then we can take that wage and put it into either one of these two, but it's easiest to put it into this equation here. So then the quantity is just 10 times 4, or 40. Okay, so that gives us the equilibrium price in this market of $4 and the equilibrium quantity in this market of 40 units of labor. Okay, so then the hard part starts. So the next question is going to ask you to look at two different potential interventions. All right, so this is actually going to be a pretty involved and long question. And we're going to look at an intervention that is going to give us a minimum wage of $5 per hour, right? And we're going to see how that changes the equilibrium wage in the market and the quantity of labor supplied. And then we're going to, or the quantity of labor that's exchanged. And then we're going to look at a wage subsidy of $1 per hour, right? So a minimum wage is going to be a price floor because the price can't go below that, and then a wage subsidy is just going to drive a wedge in between the price to the buyer and the price to the seller. But instead of a tax where the price to the buyer is higher than the price to the seller, in a subsidy, the price the buyer pays is lower than the price the seller receives. So we're going to have to work through that. And so this suggests that we should do it by looking at diagrams as well as doing the calculations. All right, so let's start off with the price floor because we haven't done that before. Okay, so we've got a price floor of $5. So let's just start by thinking about what this looks like. Okay, so let's draw our graph. All right, so we've got a typical market graph, all right, and we're going to have the market demand, right? So here, draw the market demand. And we are going to have a supply, the market supply. That's going to look like this. So here's our supply, here's our demand, and we know if there's no intervention in this market, we've already solved for what the equilibrium quantity is. It's 40, and what the equilibrium price is. Okay, so the first thing is to look at, oops, sorry about that, hit the camera, is to look at the wage subsidy. Sorry, not the wage subsidy. First, we're going to look at the wage floor. All right, the minimum wage. So if we set a minimum wage of $5, right, what we're saying is that the price cannot go below $5, right? So here's our $5 price floor, right? We're saying it can't go below that. Well, one thing that this is going to do is it's going to create some serious excess supply. right? So the number of people who want to work in this market exceeds the number of jobs that are available by a lot. But we're just going to focus on the lower of the two, right? Because if you have a excess supply, you're not going to be able to do anything about it if you can't lower the wage. And so what we're going to have is a quantity that's going to be demanded at this higher price, right? So if the price is $5, demand is the lower of the two, and that determines how much is going to be sold. So we just take $5 and we plug it into the demand curve, right? So the quantity demanded at $5 is 80 minus 10 times 5, or 30. Boy, Leo is really into this problem set today. Sorry about this, guys. I'm going to kick him off the table. He's not going to be happy about that, but okay. All right, so we have that the quantity here is 30, and of course the price or the wage is 5. So that was pretty easy to figure out what the impact was on wages and prices. But we also have to think about what it did to worker and employer surplus and deadweight loss, right? So we can think about that in a couple of different ways, right? So if we want to think about what that does to employer surplus, we really just want to think about what is the difference between employer surplus before and after, all right? So employer surplus, which is really the same as consumer surplus in this situation. So we have consumer surplus before minimum wage and consumer surplus after minimum wage. And we can figure that out graphically, right? So we know what all these points are. The one thing we don't have is this intercept. We can calculate that pretty easy, right? We've got the demand curve here. We just need to get an inverse demand to figure out what the intercept is, right? So our demand curve is quantity demanded equals 80 minus 10W, right? To get the inverse demand, we want the W term by itself. So we get 10W, take it to the left-hand side, equals 80 minus QD, and then divide by 10, and we get W equals 8 minus QD over 10, right? So we now know that this intercept is 8. So then the consumer surplus before the minimum wage is just 1/2 times the height of the triangle, right? This triangle, the difference between the willingness to pay as we get off the demand curve and what was actually paid. So before the minimum wage, the difference was, the height here was 8 minus 4, and the quantity or the base was 40. So 1/2 times 4 times 40 is just going to give us 80, right? So our pre-minimum wage consumer surplus is 80, and our post-minimum wage consumer surplus is 1/2 times 8 minus 5, right? Because we now have a smaller height, times 30, right? We have also a smaller number of units. And then that's 3. So 1/2 times 3 times 30 is going to be 45, right? So we have a lower consumer surplus not only because fewer units are being consumed, but also because the amount that they're getting per unit has dropped dramatically. All right, so what about producer surplus? So producer surplus before the minimum wage. All right, well that's 1/2 times the difference between the price they received, or 4. And note here with the supply curve, if we want to get the inverse here, we just divide by 10. And so we get QS over 10 equals W. All right, let me show you that, right? Because that's an easy one to do. So the intercept is actually 0, right? So to calculate producer surplus before and after, it's 4 minus 0, or 4, times 40. Once again, that's going to be 80, right? And then the producer surplus after is 1/2 times 5 times 35, right? So it's 5 because we've got this higher number here. But that's actually not true, right? So it's no longer a triangle. So we have to calculate this a little differently. So let's scratch that out, right? We can't just do a triangle. What we have is a triangle here, and then a square, right? So if we look at overall producer surplus, right, it's this distance. All right, so let's calculate what that is. So we can first do what this triangle is. So producer surplus after minimum wage. All right, so let's do the triangle part. That's 1/2 times 30, right? 1/2 times 30, and then we need to know what this is, right? So that's easy to find out, right? Because that is essentially what would the wage have to be for people to voluntarily only supply 30 units, right? And so we can figure that out by looking at the supply curve and saying, for this supply curve, let me get up to there, right? What would the wage have to be for us to supply 30 units? Well, 30 equals 10 times whatever this amount is, and that would, of course, be 3, right? So we know that this is 3. Everybody see why? So if quantity supplied is 30, then W has to equal 3, right? Okay, so coming back down here, so what is this triangle? It's 1/2 times 30 times 3, okay? So that is equal to 45 plus, right, that's the triangle, plus for all of those 30 units, we have then this distance, which is the distance between 3 and 5, or just 2. So 30 times 2 is equal to 60. And so we get 45 plus 60, which gives us 105. Okay, so we went from a producer surplus of 80 to a producer surplus of 105. So that's an increase of 25. But note that what we did is we went from a consumer surplus of 80 to a consumer surplus of 45, which is a loss of 35, right? And so what we have is overall a loss in total surplus, right? So total surplus before was equal to 80 plus 80, or 160. And total surplus after is equal to 45 plus 105, which is equal to 150. And that means that the deadweight loss from this is equal to 10. Okay, so we have a deadweight loss from this wage subsidy of $10, or for 10 units, and we have a shift in terms of the surplus from before it was equal, each side got 80, to now the employers get significantly less and the workers get significantly more. Okay, so that is going to be what we get with the minimum wage. Now let's look at what happens with a wage subsidy. Okay. So subsidies are just like negative taxes. So let's draw that out. So we've got a demand curve here, a supply curve here. We've already figured out that was 8, and that was 0. And here's our equilibrium without any intervention. Okay, so let me bring that down. Okay, so that is the market before we put the subsidy in. Now if we add in a wage subsidy, and the wage subsidy in this question is a wage subsidy of $1 per hour, right? And so what that's going to do is drive a wedge between the price that the buyers pay and the price that the sellers receive. So the buyers are going to pay $1 less than the sellers receive. So the price to the buyers plus $1 equals the price to the seller, right? And so once again, that's going to draw a wedge in between these two prices. We, if you recall, when we did the tax problem in an earlier video, we calculated that what you need to do is to redraw the supply curve, referencing not the price to the seller, but the price to the buyer, right? And so the difference between the price to the seller and the price to the buyer here is negative $1, right? So the price to the seller is $1 greater than the price to the buyer. And so what we do is we then drop the supply curve by 1 unit. Sorry, we dropped the supply curve by 1 unit. My computer went to sleep. I'm getting too long-winded, I guess. And so what we're going to get is a quantity that is greater than the equilibrium quantity and a price to the buyer, right? We know it's the price to the buyer because it's on the demand curve, that is lower to the price than the price to the seller. And so what we want to find out is what is this quantity that makes the price to the, that makes the supply curve and the demand curve equal, given that there's this wedge between them from the subsidy. Okay, so how do we actually then calculate that, right? Well, let's go ahead and talk about what the price to the, what the supply curve looks like. The supply curve is 10 times W, right, the wage, and that's the wage that the seller receives, that the buyer, that's the wage that the seller receives, right? That's what the individual who's selling his labor gets. Okay, and then that is equal to the demand, which is 80 minus 10 times the wage to the buyer. But of course, the wage to the buyer is equal to the wage to the seller minus 1, right? And so we can put this all in terms of the wage to the seller. We get 10 WS equals 80 minus 10 times WS minus 1, right? So I've just translated this wage to the buyer, recognizing that the wage to the buyer is less than the wage to the seller. So let's rewrite this. We get 10 WS equals 80 minus 10 WS plus 10, right? Negative 10 times negative 1 is going to be positive 10. So that's going to give us 20 WS equals 90, or WS equals 4.5, right? And then WB is going to be 4.5 minus 1, or 3.5. So here we've got 4.5 and 3.5. Those are our new prices, our wages. And then we figure out what the quantity is. And so the easiest way to do it is to take this and put it into our supply curve. So 10 times 4.5 equals 45. All right, so we have an increase of labor of 5 units from 40 to 45. Okay, and so we want to think about then what does this do to worker and employer surplus. So we know from when we did it just a second ago for minimum wage that consumer surplus before was 80. And producer surplus was 80, right? So that was this area for consumer surplus and this area for producer surplus. Okay, so now we need to figure out what consumer and producer surplus are after the subsidy. Okay, so now what we have is a quantity of 45 and a price for the buyers of 3.5, right? So their consumer surplus is actually going to grow, and it's going to grow to encompass this area in here, right? And so it's going to be equal to 1/2 times 8 minus 3.5 times 45, right? Which is just 1/2 times 4.5 times 45, or 101.25. So that's a consumer surplus after the subsidy. How about the workers? What's their surplus after the subsidy? All right. Well, remember now the workers are getting $4.50, and so they were getting before this area. Now they're going to additionally get this area. Okay, sorry, I got called away, so there's a little bit of a jump from where we were. So we were talking about producer surplus after the subsidy and how we calculate that. So just to go back to where we were, remember we're now thinking with the subsidy that we're looking for this area here. So it's the difference between the price they receive, which is the subsidized price of $4.50, and of course their marginal cost. And we look for the whole quantity here, this higher level of labor of 45. So it's 1/2 times 4.5 minus 0, because this is the height of this new extended triangle, times 45, the width of this new triangle. And so that gives us 101.25. So now if we want to think about total surplus after the subsidy, we've got the 101.25 of consumer surplus and the 101.25 of producer surplus, but we have to think too about the amount that the government is pushing into this system, right? And so there are 45 units of labor, and for each unit of labor there's a $1 subsidy, and that's a decrease from total surplus. And so that gives us a total surplus of 202.5 minus 45, right, or 157.5. All right, so that's our new total surplus. And if we want to think then about the deadweight loss, right, so the deadweight loss is the difference between total surplus before and after. And so total surplus before, see, total surplus after. Total surplus before was 160, and total surplus after is 157.5. So we've got deadweight loss of 2.5. Okay, so now we've calculated what happens when we have a subsidy, and we want to then answer the final question, which is, which policy do you think is best? Either the minimum wage of $5 an hour or the wage subsidy of $1 per hour. So one way you might want to think about comparing these is to think about the impact on employment. You might also want to think about the relative consumer and producer surplus, and you might also want to think about the deadweight loss. Okay, so let's think about the minimum wage and then the subsidy. Okay, so for minimum wage, the impact of employment is to decrease the number of units employed by 10. We do shift a lot of surplus from consumers to producers, or employers to workers. So it used to be an 80-80 split, and now it's 45-105. So a significant change in the relative surplus of producers and consumers, but it does come with a deadweight loss of 10. The subsidy has a positive impact on employment and a smaller deadweight loss. I put an asterisk here. We'll come back to that in just a second. But note that it does have no change in the relative surplus to employers and workers. Now that is actually because of the nature of these supply and demand curves and the fact that the elasticities are the same between the two. If they were different, then we might see the subsidy have a bigger impact on one versus the other. But this is sort of an artifact of the way this problem was set up. And you might think that that's good, you might think that's bad. It really depends on what your perspective is. But it's just a fact that there's a different change in the way the surplus is distributed. And some of the surplus that's coming out of the subsidy is actually going to employers, not to workers. So more workers are being employed. We are increasing overall the amount of surplus going to workers, but employers are benefiting as well. And then the last thing I'll say, coming back to this asterisk, is this is the deadweight loss just associated with the subsidy. Remember, we did have to use $45 of government money to be able to create the subsidy, and that's got to come from somewhere, and there will be a marginal excess burden of taxation associated with collecting that revenue so that we can use it in this market. And so that would actually increase the deadweight loss somewhat. Not dramatically, it's not going to double it, but for $45 in subsidy, you might have a deadweight loss of another 2.5 or 5. It just really depends on what market you're taxing to be able to collect those revenues. So don't forget about that. So if you're going to think about which policy is best, it's really going to depend on your own personal view and what you think is more important. Is it about the relative surplus going to workers versus employers, or is it about increasing the amount of labor that is employed? So that's going to be not a positive question, a question of fact, but a normative question, a question of value. All right, so hopefully this will help you with problem 4 on problem set 1. Thanks. Bye.